In Greek mythology, the greatest warrior was Achilles. Then the greatest hero was likely Heracles. But the smartest man in almost every room he ever walked into was Odysseus. He was the king of Ithaca, which was a relatively minor island kingdom with no claim to glory. First of all, he didn't have divine blood or supernatural gifts. What he had was a mind that operated several steps ahead of everyone else, and a willingness to use it in ways that other heroes considered beneath them. Ancient writers called him Metis and gave him the nickname, the wiliest of men. That reputation wasn't handed to him because he had earned it. Repeatedly, in situations where everyone else was stuck and Odysseus quietly found the angle nobody else had considered. Here's some of these few moments. Before the Trojan War even began, Odysseus walked into one of the messiest political situations of the ancient world and solved it before breakfast. King Tyndareus of Sparta had a beautiful daughter named Helen, but the problem of choosing her a husband had attracted no fewer than 45 suitors, each of them fully prepared to go to war if the king chose anyone other than them. If he chose any one man, then the other 44 would consider it an insult worth acting on. Odysseus saw the solution immediately, yet he also saw an opportunity. He was in love with Helen's cousin Penelope, and he wanted the king's blessing to marry her. So he offered Tyndareus a deal to solve your Helen problem in exchange for Penelope's hand. The king agreed, so Odysseus proposed an oath. Every single suitor before Helen's husband was announced would swear to defend and protect whoever she married against any threat to that union. All 45 men bound themselves by their word to support the eventual winner. The tension dissolved overnight. Since Helen married Menelaus, Odysseus married Penelope, and everyone went home. The oath Odysseus engineered would later become the legal mechanism that started the Trojan War. Eventually, when Paris took Helen, Menelaus invoked it so that every suitor would come try to interrupt it. Odysseus had essentially written the contract that would define the next decade of Greek history as a side condition for getting a date. Then came the problem of Achilles. The prophecy was clear, explaining the Trojan War could not be won without him. The issue was that Achilles wasn't home, and his mother Thetis, knowing the prophecy, also said he wouldn't survive the war. It had hidden him at the court of Scyros, disguised as a woman, so Menelaus sent Odysseus to find him. Odysseus found out where Achilles was hidden and didn't waste time with a direct approach. He disguised himself as a traveling merchant selling women's clothes and accessories to the women of the court. Among the goods, he hid a single sword. When he presented his wares, every woman in the room reached for fabric and jewelry. One of them reached for the sword. That was Achilles. Revealed by his own instincts, the disguise unraveling in a single moment of curiosity. Odysseus then persuaded him to fight, with the promise of undying glory, exactly the currency Achilles valued most. It's worth noting that Odysseus had tried the same trick himself. When originally summoned to the war, he feigned madness to avoid going, plowing his fields and sowing salt into the soil. A man named Palladium saw through it by placing Odysseus's infant son in the path of the plow. Odysseus immediately swerved to avoid the child, proving his sanity. He went to Troy and never forgave Palladium for the exposure. Years later, Odysseus planted gold in Palladium's tent and forged a letter from King Priam appearing to pay him for treason. The Greeks believed it, causing them to stone Palladium to death. Odysseus had a very long memory and a very particular approach to settling scores. 10 years into the war, the Greeks were still outside Troy's walls. The city had been built by gods like Poseidon and Apollo, who had laid the foundations, yet nothing the Greek army had tried could break through. Then a Trojan prophet named Helenus was captured, and under interrogation revealed something critical. Troy would not fall while it still possessed the Palladium, that being a sacred wooden statue of Athena that the Trojans believed guaranteed the city's divine protection. Odysseus, dressed as a beggar, slipped into Troy through a secret passage. There, Helen was located, who was, by this account, not exactly a willing guest in the city and was happy to help. With the location identified, Odysseus returned with his companion Diomedes and stole the Palladium from behind the walls of a city that held against the Greek army for decades. What followed was the plan that ended the war entirely and gave Odysseus his most enduring legacy, a giant wooden horse built to appear as a religious offering to Athena. The entire Greek army staged a retreat to a nearby island, leaving the horse on the beach with one man. That was Sinon, specifically planted behind to sell the story. Sinon told the Trojans he had been abandoned by the Greeks, that the horse was a sacred tribute, and that the gods would bless whoever brought it inside the city walls. Inside were selected Greek soldiers waiting. Whenever the city slept, they would emerge. After 10 years and countless casualties, Troy fell in a single night to a plan that didn't require a frontal assault, didn't require divine intervention. It only worked entirely because Odysseus had correctly read exactly how the Trojans would respond to a story carefully designed for their beliefs. By the time the war was over, getting home was another matter in itself. Odysseus and his crew were captured by Theon-eyed giant Cyclops, who sealed them in his cave with an enormous boulder. He ate 2 crew members immediately and planned to finish the rest later, with the boulder being too large to move and Polyphemus too large to fight. Odysseus started thinking. He got the Cyclops drunk on wine and told him his name was Autus, a name that nobody held in ancient Greece. When Odysseus then drove a heated stake into Polyphemus's eye, the screaming giant called out to the other Cyclopes for help. They came running and asked who was hurting him, where in response Polyphemus screamed that nobody was hurting him. Odysseus then tied his surviving crew members to the undersides of the sheep that Polyphemus kept in the cave. When the blind giant moved the boulder to let his flock out to pasture, running his hands over their backs to make sure no prisoners escaped, he felt nothing unusual except every surviving crew member who walked out with the sheep. It is one of the most elegant escapes in the entire mythology, simply because it was precise. Odysseus didn't overpower Polyphemus, he outthought him at every step. Then there were the sirens. According to legend, any sailor who heard their song lost all rational thought and drowned trying to reach them. Odysseus wanted to hear it, not despite the danger, but because surviving the siren's song was said to grant secret knowledge. However, he found a way to have both. He had his crew pack their ears with wax and commanded them to bind him to the mast of the ship. He would hear everything and be unable to act on it. So when the ship sailed past the island and the song hit him, he struggled against the ropes and begged to be freed. Still, the crew couldn't hear him and just rode on. He heard the sirens and lived. Nonetheless, though the crew was never at risk, the journey home took 10 years. When Odysseus finally reached Ithaca, 20 years after leaving, he didn't announce himself. He arrived disguised as a beggar with the help of the goddess Athena's magic and quietly assessed what he was walking back into. His house had been taken over by men who had moved in during his absence and were competing to marry Penelope while treating Odysseus's home like their own property. His wife had been stalling them for years with a trick of her own, weaving a burial shroud by day and unraveling it by night, promising to choose a husband when it was finished. Odysseus found his son Telemachus first and revealed himself in private. Telemachus secretly retrieved the weapons from the palace while Odysseus mingled with the suitors in his own home, absorbing insults and biding his time. One suitor treated him with some basic decency until Odysseus quietly warned him to leave. But boldly enough he didn't, when he should have. Penelope, still not knowing her husband had returned, set the final mechanism in motion herself. She announced a competition. Whoever could string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads would win her hand in marriage. It was a feat that only Odysseus had ever accomplished. The suitors tried one by one and failed. Then the beggar in the corner asked if he could try. He strung the bow, shot the arrow clean through all 12, and the room understood what was happening about 3 seconds too late. What followed was not fair, but was a slaughter. Odysseus, Telemachus, and Athena against a house full of men who had spent years making themselves comfortable in the wrong man's home. Then there's Penelope, who hadn't survived 20 years of pressure and manipulation without developing a sharp sense of skepticism, going on to test the man claiming to be her husband one final time. She told a servant to move their marriage bed out of the bedroom, influencing Odysseus to erupt. He had built that bed himself, carving it from the living olive tree at the center of the house. That detail was known only to him, Penelope, and one servant. It's worth focusing on Penelope for a moment, because her role in this story often gets overshadowed by Odysseus's adventures, and it shouldn't. While he was sailing and scheming and surviving monsters, she was holding his kingdom together through 20 years of pressure from men who refused to leave. The weaving trick alone took 3 years of unraveling her own work each night, requiring the same kind of methodical, patient intelligence that made Odysseus famous. Homer himself implies that their shared cleverness was what made them work. Two people who both understood that the right move wasn't always the obvious one. With all of these 8 moments, that's what made Odysseus the smartest man in the room. It was not strength, nor was it divine favor. It was simply just the ability to see what everyone else was missing and the patience to wait until exactly the right moment to use it.